China is one of the 21st century's most consequential nations. It has never been more important to understand how the country is governed and what its leaders and its people actually want and believe. Welcome to Pekingology, the podcast that unpacks China's evolving political system and the trajectory of China's domestic and foreign policy. I'm your host, Henrietta Levin, Senior Fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. This is Pekingology. The South China Sea is one of the most dangerous and complicated flashpoints in East Asia. China claims nearly all of the South China Sea's land and water, setting up conflicts with its Southeast Asian neighbors, the United States, and the broader international community. 10 years ago, an international arbitral tribunal found the vast majority of Chinese claims in the South China Sea to be unlawful. China boycotted that process and denies the ruling's legitimacy, but the court's decision has been accepted by a long list of maritime nations. So this 10-year anniversary gives us a good opportunity to check on China's evolving strategy in the South China Sea. And for that, I am very pleased to be joined today by Greg Pulling, Director of the Southeast Asia Program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Greg literally wrote the book on geopolitical contestation and international law in the South China Sea, which is called On Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea. So, Greg, thank you so much for coming on the show.
I am so honored to have made the big time. It's a real honor.
I should also say Greg has an exceptional podcast called Southeast Asia Radio that is almost, but not quite as good as the show we do here. So if you're looking for like a number 2 slot in your roster, that might be a good option.
I think it is proportionally good to how much interest there is on Southeast Asia versus China here in Washington, D.C.
So to start off, hoping you can share a bit about your background and how you came to be the guy who writes books about very important but very small rocks in the middle of the ocean.
The same way most people in D.C. got to their careers, whether they'll admit it or not, which is like dumb luck and happenstance.
Happenstance is very important in this town.
That's right. Yeah. As an undergrad, I just happened to spend a month living in Beijing with my friend's grandparents in a hutong in Beijing before they were all knocked down. I came back and spent my last 2 years studying Chinese and went to Fudan for a semester, taught English in Shanghai for a while. And then when I came back to DC for grad school, I was going to do Asia because you couldn't do China. But I thought I was going to be a China guy at American. And somehow through coursework, I migrated into Southeast Asia and ended up doing a weird combination of my master's thesis on Indonesia and my language exam in Mandarin. And I've been working on Southeast Asia here at CSIS really ever since for the last 15 years. And that included a nerdy interest in GIS and mapping work and satellite imagery, which paired with a nerdy interest in maritime law. And somehow that happened to coincide with the Chinese takeover of Scarborough Shoal in 2012 and a huge bubble of interest in the South China Sea. And I was lucky enough to ride that interest through no particular talent or foresight of my own.
Talent developed, at least, over time, I would argue. And I would guess that the portion of our viewers that listen to this podcast and don't know what AMTI is probably small, but just in case, Greg's program is the folks that put out all of the satellite imagery on what China and other claimants are doing in the South China Sea. It's an incredible resource if folks are not yet familiar.
Thank you.
So, to just dive into it, why does the South China Sea matter to China? And why does it also matter for everyone else?
So it matters to different people in China for a whole lot of different reasons, depending on what their parochial self-interests are. But I think the reason it matters to party leadership and to Xi Jinping is the political salience, the nationalist narrative that the party has really cooked up over the last couple of decades in particular. And so it's gotten vanishingly close to being one of China's core interests, whether or not it really is in the eye of the beholder, but it's certainly become hardwired into the China dream or the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And Xi, from his very first policy speeches as party leader, has talked about the recovery of lost territories in the South China Sea, along with the mission of becoming a maritime power as core to his political mission.
And Then in terms of why this matters for everyone else, because of course China says that it doesn't, that this is at most a bilateral issue between China and its bordering nations. But I think sitting in Washington, a lot of folks here have a different perspective.
That's right. So if you're a Southeast Asian claimant, it matters because you should have the same right to the same maritime zones that all the other 180-something member states of the United Nations have. And China's effort to claim so-called historic rights across the South China Sea, at the end of the day, means that China is saying that the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia are the only countries on Earth that are not entitled to the full rights of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf. And that's just simply unacceptable for China's neighbors. So whether that means fishing rights, law enforcement rights, oil and gas rights, or just the bare notion that we live in a world of rules and norms and institutions, that is all particularly salient for the Southeast Asians. For everybody else, the third parties like the U.S., it boils down to freedom of the seas, and that's broader than the concept of freedom of navigation, the right of U.S. Navy or commercial ships to go from point A to point B. But it basically means that outside states cannot accept the idea that China gets to claim 5 times as much sea and airspace as every other country on Earth, because that would undermine the entire regime of international law. You can't carve out such a giant exceptional claim for a single power just because it's gotten a navy in the last couple of years and thinks, or the last couple of decades, and thinks it can throw its weight around and expect that not to bring down the whole deck of cards.
So China has at least nominally held these sweeping claims in the South China Sea for many years, but the methods through which it has tried to enforce those claims have evolved significantly over time, and the prioritization that Beijing seems to have placed on this has also apparently increased. How can we look at what China's actually doing on the water to get a better sense of Beijing's goals and priorities in the South China Sea?
Yeah, so I think there's been 2 ongoing evolutions. The first is in the nature of China's claims, and the second is in the risk tolerance that Beijing has shown in advancing them. So on the first, I want to be crystal clear, these claims are not ancient. The maritime claims in particular are younger than I am. There's no Chinese official ever used the word historic rights or defined the 9-dash line as a maritime boundary before the late 80s, certainly the early 90s. This whole concept of historic rights was only baked into domestic Chinese law in 1998. So for decades, the reason that most of the outside world didn't care that much about the South China Sea is because China's claims were limited to the rocks. And nobody really had that big a stake in who had sovereignty over the rocks, as long as that was pursued peacefully. That included the U.S. So over the last 30, 35 years, what we've seen is China's claims have advanced beyond just arguments over who owns the Spratly Islands or the Paracel Islands to this much more ambitious and more illegal claim that everything within the South China Sea, all the water, seabed, airspace, has some kind of historic Chinese imprint on it that the rest of the world has to respect, that goes beyond customary international law and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That's problem one. That's what's drawn in the international community.
Can I just ask, in terms of that pivot, where you see historical rights be integrated more deeply into China's own vision of its sovereignty and power, like, what do you make of that moment in time? Like, why then?
It was a weird combination of, ironically, an outcome of cross-strait academic exchange at the time. The concept of historic rights and what Taiwan would call the U-shaped line being a national boundary, that evolved in academic circles in the KMT, not in the mainland, at least not primarily. And then it was carried through academic exchange and conferences and faculty from Taiwan in Chinese universities into the mainland in the late 80s. And eventually there was a decision by the mid to late 90s in Taiwan explicitly to reject this, that Taipei had an opportunity and rejected the opportunity to bake historic rights into its maritime laws in the late 90s. And China went the other direction and embraced this idea, which was an import from Taiwan. I think it also coincides with a degree of hubris that emerged on the maritime front in China as a result of the naval modernization launched from 79 onward, and that really picked up steam and led to the 1987 and 1988 occupations in the Spratlys. So at the same time that this new concept of the 9-dash line, the U-shaped line being a national boundary, came across the strait, you had particularly a naval complex in China that was riding high after getting tons and tons of money dumped on it, and suddenly these new footholds in the Spratlys in 87 and 88.
And then going forward from the late 90s, how do you see China's tactics evolving and enforcing that perspective?
So even as that claim was being baked in, nobody paid that much attention, except in rare cases like the seizure of Mischief Reef in 95, because China still didn't have much of a blue water navy and certainly didn't have blue water law enforcement capabilities to extend.
Because these claims are effectively academic until more recent years.
Yeah, so you'd get one-offs, like after 95, you had to have the State Department issue these statements, pretty boilerplate about we don't accept the use of force to resolve territorial disputes, and we'd view with concern any maritime claims that do infringe on the rights of third parties, which was our sly way of saying, look, if this historic rights thing means what we think it means, it's going to be a problem. But for now, the Chinese Navy can't do anything about it, so we're going to set it aside. But over the course of the 2000s, China became more and more capable, threw its weight around more. You started to get a significant uptick in violence between mostly FLEC, the fisheries law enforcement, which was one of the 5 that went into the modern China Coast Guard, and fishers and oil and gas operators from Vietnam and the Philippines over the course of 2008, 9, 10. That then led Southeast Asians to ask for more support from the international community. That led directly to the famous or infamous 2010 moment where then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton stood up at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi at the behest of the ASEANs and declared that freedom of navigation and peaceful resolution of disputes in the South China Sea was U.S. national interest. So this increasing violence, increasing coercion, it was beginning in the late Hu Jintao era. Xi Jinping takes over at the end of 2012, in 2013, depending on if you want to say president or head of CMC, and really hits the gas. So we see an accelerating risk tolerance that is most evident both in the seizure of Scarborough Shoal in 2012, in which she was reportedly involved as vice president, but then particularly in the launch of the island building campaign at the end of 2013, which had been kicked around in Chinese elite circles for a decade and had always been rejected by Xi's predecessors as too provocative and too risky.
And so now, where do you see tensions highest in the South China Sea? Where is China focusing its growing coercive power?
Scarborough Shoal. We've never seen, at least in the last couple of decades, we have not seen South China Sea tensions so narrowly focused on a single spot as we have over the last year. The story that our team at AMTI was tracking for really the last decade was more pressure everywhere, across the board. And China had a lot of success because of its quantitative advantages in just kind of pushing everywhere, and the Southeast Asians couldn't be everywhere. Well, Southeast Asian states have actually had a fair amount of success of their own over the last 5 years in stabilizing the situation, which I'm happy to talk about. And I know that clashes with the conventional wisdom on where the South China Sea stands. But the one place where we've seen China push back hardest has been Scarborough. The Philippines has been...
And Scarborough is very close to the Philippines.
That's right, 100 plus miles off the coast of Luzon, well within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. It is a high tide feature, meaning that the fact that it's in the Philippine EEZ doesn't legally matter. It could still be claimed by either China or the Philippines, but it was under Philippine administrative control for decades and is a traditional Philippine fishing ground, which is why there's always been this cycle of tension since China seized it, because Filipino fishers are going to keep showing up. The Philippine Coast Guard therefore feels compelled to go out and show the flag and protect its fishers. And under the Marcos administration, since 2022, we've seen pretty consistent Philippine efforts to patrol around the shoal and growing Chinese efforts to push that back. And over the last year, that has meant dozens of Chinese vessels around the shoal at all times, to the point that this year our annual report on China Coast Guard patrol showed that for the first time since we've started doing this, China had to pull forces away from other patrol locations in the South China Sea in order to keep up the pressure at Scarborough. Because even for China's Coast Guard, which is the largest in the world, keeping that many vessels at Scarborough, hundreds of miles from the Chinese coast or any Chinese base, day in and day out, has a toll. And the other piece of this is that we're seeing an increasing tolerance for risk when it comes to the tactics being employed. China still refuses to escalate to military force, but the, quote, non-lethals it's willing to use are getting pretty close to that. The rammings, the water cannons, the dazzlers, the unsafe air intercepts, sometimes the acoustic devices. We've seen numerous cases where the fact that nobody died is luck more than anything else. And I worry that eventually they will roll snake eyes and we'll have an escalation that neither side wanted.
And then overlapping with this trend on the water, we have some, you could say, complicated political dynamics in Beijing when it comes to command and control of the PLA, with the majority of the Central Military Commission now being purged and significant removals across the full leadership of the PLA. And our colleagues at CSIS and the China Power Project have done some interesting work to show that it does seem like the degraded leadership capability of the PLA has some effect on at least how they pursue military action against Taiwan. When it comes to these large-scale exercises we've seen in recent years, there are delays that appear to be correlated with the purges. Do you see any connection between the increasingly vacant nature of PLA leadership and how China pursues gray zone coercion in the South China Sea? Or is this set of tools so routine for China that it can run on autopilot?
So we've seen a couple incidents that have raised real concerns about increasing involvement of the PLA Navy in these disputes, which over the last decade, the standard operating procedure has been for the China Coast Guard and the Chinese militia to be in the lead. We've seen the Navy patrolling closer and closer to Scarborough and getting more involved in direct confrontations with the Philippines. Most explosively, that led last August to a Chinese Navy frigate colliding with a China Coast Guard cutter, resulting in the loss of life of at least 2 Chinese personnel, which was the first uniformed loss of life in the South China Sea in almost 35 years. I'm sorry, more than that, 37 years, I suppose. Immediately after that, you had Chinese Navy live fire exercises around Second Thomas Shoal down in the Spratlys, which had earlier been a site of contestation with the Philippines. That's abated, but I do worry that we'll see more of that. But I think that the overall pattern remains that most of this is on autopilot, meaning that Xi Jinping sits atop the world's arguably largest and most complicated bureaucracy. And the more people that get purged and the more he collects power into his own hands, just as a rule of nature, a rule of dictatorial regimes, he is less and less able to micromanage issues on the ground. He's getting bad news, I assume, with a greater and greater delay. So when people ask, why did X happen in the South China Sea when there was just a summit with Trump, or this happened with the Philippines, my answer is usually because Xi Jinping probably found out about it at the same time you and I did. He has put in place an enormous kind of clockwork mechanism of incentives to get the bureaucracy to pursue the rights protection mission in the South China Sea. And they are doing that, often with increasing brazenness. But I don't think that he is keeping an eye on the biweekly interactions with the Philippine Coast Guard around Scarborough Shoal.
It's a good reminder of one way in which the risk profile in the South China Sea is particularly dangerous. If you think about this in contrast to something like Taiwan, where there probably are at least more, and there's more intentionality behind each method of coercion that would be used in the military domain. Whereas if a clock just keeps ticking and gets it wrong at some point in the South China Sea, you could see an escalation spiral that no one really chose, but everyone feels they have to pursue.
Yeah, and multiple times over the last few years, we have seen that when things almost get out of hand in the South China Sea, the June 2024 incident around Second Thomas, where a Filipino sailor was maimed by China Coast Guard personnel wielding axes, or earlier incidents with Indonesia, where then President Jokowi had to go out and make a big stink about it. When it hits a certain threshold of risk, then Beijing, presumably Xi himself, does get personally involved, and things can then de-escalate quite quickly. But they really have to spin up before you get to that point in the South China Sea. And that's what worries me, that we could wake up tomorrow and find out that there was a collision, Filipino sailors overboard, shots fired, and by the time anybody gets the courage to go into the boss's office and say something's wrong in the South China Sea, it's gotten so much worse than it needs to. And the de-escalation becomes so much harder, particularly compounded by all of the longstanding issues around the inability to get hotlines to work and get Chinese interlocutors on the phone. And are there even Chinese interlocutors that matter anymore, particularly in the PLA Navy?
And it's, of course, when in thinking about how China manages those maybe inadvertent moments of escalation, I would assume that she probably isn't looking to push, at least so quickly, in the South China Sea that he would risk drawing in the United States or causing a more significant conflict with neighbors. But at the same time, once an escalation begins, it's not like we should assume she's just looking to get out of it. He has demonstrated rather ultranationalist proclivities. And at this point, whether or not those are deeply held personally for him, who knows? He's created an ecosystem where he has to live up to them. So it strikes me as stressful.
That's right. And
before you even get into the complicated dynamics in other capitals that would be relevant.
That's right. Yeah. And there are political pressures in all the other capitals, too, that would make de-escalation difficult, I think, in particular in Manila, but also in Vietnam in certain contexts. The other danger here is I think we have reason to believe that Chinese officers on station, the ones who are actually in charge of these dozens of vessels, or the South Sea Fleet commanders who are in charge of the overall campaigns, are also growing increasingly frustrated. And I think there's reason to believe it's just looking at the activities on the ground, but I've also heard this from Chinese interlocutors that they think they're growing frustrated as well because they're really given an impossible mission. They have been told, you must stop all of this activity. Stop the Philippine resupplies to Second Thomas. Stop the Philippine patrols at Scarborough. Stop Vietnamese and Malaysian oil and gas exploration. And over the last 5 years, as I said, the South Asians have actually gotten quite good at ignoring Chinese gray zone coercion and doing what they want to do, which is why the disputes in a sense have plateaued. But then the flip side of that is the Chinese forces on the ground are being told, but don't open fire, don't escalate. And what we saw at Second Thomas and what we see at Scarborough is that leads to dangerous iteration on non-lethal force in a way that really starts to blur the line. Non-lethals are only non-lethals in a statistical sense. Sooner or later, somebody dies. And the more that these actors on the ground are facing impossible contradictory orders from Beijing, the more I think they get kind of desperate and they do things that should be considered unprofessional. And we saw that play out most explosively in the June 2024 incident at Second Thomas, where I think the Philippine Navy really took the Chinese commanders on site by surprise. And the response was somewhat harried and dangerous and probably got whoever made the decision in some serious trouble in Beijing when eventually it had to be de-escalated.
Yeah, and in that incident, it seems almost more likely than not that someone would have died. In a way, it feels quite lucky that the casualties were as limited as they were, given the aggression, but also just chaos of that kind of interaction.
Yeah, and so to remind people what happened, so you had a 1.5 year long buildup of forces where every month, like clockwork, the Philippines would send out 2 civilian vessels with a Coast Guard escort. And by the end of 2023, we had at times 70 Chinese ships around the shoal. So this kind of blockade that the Filipinos were running, getting rammed, water cannoned, etc. You had multiple significant injuries, including to a Philippine general officer at one point who I think broke a collarbone when his vessel was hit by a water cannon. In June 2024, the Philippine Navy took over the operation and sent ribs, rigid hull inflatables, racing into the shoal to try to avoid...
Which are smaller vessels.
Smaller, faster, more maneuverable. And it kind of broke the pattern, and I think China panicked. So China sent out its own ribs, except the Philippine soldiers had their weapons locked underneath their seats, and the Chinese Coast Guard personnel were waving boat hooks and axes. And the injury happened because as the Filipinos had already tied up alongside the BRP Sierra Madre, their vessels were violently rammed by these Chinese ribs. And a Philippine sailor had his hand pinned between 2 of the ships and lost his thumb. And that's kind of idiosyncratic, but it could have happened any number of ways. If he had been pinned by the forearm, he probably would have bled out. It took hours to get him evacuated. You easily could have had that incident escalate to actual use of those weapons that China was waving. So I think people are far too quick to diminish that incident and say, well, he only lost his thumb and it was eventually reattached. Yeah, he only lost his thumb by dumb luck. He or any number of other personnel could have been killed in that incident.
The Southeast Asian countries, claimants, are improving their own maritime capabilities. So in your view, that allows them to contribute to at least the achievement of a modest stalemate. But how would you think about shaping China's behavior? So not just matching it, but is there any way that either regional or international players can actually affect Beijing's own calculus about how much aggression it really wants to bring to bear in pursuing these claims?
Part of the problem is that we need to accept there are no solutions here, that the South China Sea is a classic wicked problem, and I have no more solutions to offer here than I do to the cross-strait tensions with Taiwan or to denuclearizing North Korea. And so if we can set aside those fantasies that I think a lot of people come into it with, assuming that there's some clever legal strategy here or negotiation that just hasn't been tried before.
But as a matter of risk, right? Thinking about if we want to encourage China to, on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe instead of accepting a level 8 of risk, what if it was 7? Like in the most modest possible way.
So part of it has been modernization of the armed forces and the law enforcement capabilities of the Southeast Asians, because at the end of the day, you do have to have a certain minimal credible capability in order for the Chinese to take you seriously. We see that in the disparate way that China approaches Vietnam, which I think it does take quite seriously, and it should. Vietnam has the most capable Navy and Air Force in the region compared to the way it takes the Philippines. Even though the Philippines today, after a decade of, I think, significant modernization, probably does have a more capable Navy and Coast Guard than some of its neighbors. For instance, I would argue that the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard are both more capable than their Malaysian counterparts, for instance.
Which is a pretty big change.
Yes, a significant change than just a few years ago when they were by far the weakest in the region. But how serious China takes the Philippines, both operationally and politically, is a lagging indicator. I think it's going to take a while for China to internalize the idea that the Filipinos are not a pushover. They are not going to back down just because you employ violence. And I don't know if there's a way to speed that up. I think it is largely just about managing the operational risk on our side, on the Philippine side, on the U.S. side, on the other allied side, without backing down. The Philippines has done a reasonably good job of that, in my opinion, avoiding escalation without really backing down. And now people have different opinions about specific incidents, but I would argue that the fact that Filipinos really haven't lost anything over the last few years is in itself significant. That's part of how you tread water. And then there is the mill dialogue, the risk reduction piece of this, which has been modestly effective in the U.S. China piece. I think we've seen a significant decrease in unsafe air-to-air intercepts between Chinese and U.S. aircraft over the South China Sea. It is significant. We have been unsuccessful in getting China to extend that to other allies and partners. And in fact, we've seen Chinese aggression in the air increase, not just toward the Philippines, but toward Australia, New Zealand, European aircraft, Japanese. We do need to find a way to convince the Chinese that it's in their interest to extend the same professionalism to these other air forces. And part of, I think, China's calculations here, at the end, they just don't take them seriously. They assume that there is a mutual interest in managing tension with the Americans, whereas I think China continues to believe that if it just dials up the pressure, everybody else will back off. And they're not going to back off.
There used to be a sense that public diplomacy could also play a big role in deterrence in the South China Sea. And for many years, at least my sense was that was true, that bringing greater transparency and public attention to specific acts of coercion could cause China to at least take a tactical pause. And anecdotally, that no longer seems to be true. But how would you think about the information environment in all of this and China's own perception, the degree to which it cares about reputational risk and damage?
The goal of efforts like ours and other transparency programs should not be primarily to change China's behavior. We have to be honest with ourselves. AMTI has been blocked behind the Great Firewall since 2021. The days of us directly influencing elite discussion in China are over. But that doesn't mean that Beijing doesn't care about reputational risk at all. I think it does work to manage the fallout from reputational damage on the international scene. We see that in China's efforts on cyber, on trade at the moment, trying to paint itself as a good actor. I do think if there were enough reputational cost piled, say, in UN settings or other international bodies, you could see China try to recalibrate, try to minimize how much that damages its broader international equities. Unfortunately, the best time to do that would have been in the immediate wake of the July 12th, 2016 arbitral award. It's much harder to do that now 10 years later. But you are seeing some efforts on that front. I think people are far too quick to just write this off and say, well, China doesn't care at all. I don't think that's true. China's not Russia. And China's certainly not Iran or North Korea, right? China does not view itself as a rogue state or a regional player. It views itself as a global heavyweight. It wants to be there helping set rules and norms and build institutions. And it can't do that.
China rarely says publicly that we're doing this because we're a big country and we can, though occasionally they do.
It does sometimes. Yeah.
But most of the time they say, no, our rules are the right rules.
That's
so they
right.
want it to be about a kind of legitimacy.
Right. So China is engaged in a normative competition with the U.S. and U.S. allies and partners. And it cannot win that normative competition if some critical mass of the international community writes it off as a bully and a rogue state. That does give us a lever that we can pull that doesn't really exist in the Russia case, because Russia, whatever it might think, is not a normative power. It doesn't offer any viable normative to the U.S., and it doesn't really try to. But while I think that's important to keep in mind and we should work at it, we should also remember that the most important effect of all these transparency efforts and the public diplomacy is mostly stiffening spines in the international community, rallying support for the Philippines and Vietnam, Malaysia, and others. And you've seen that have real payoff for the Philippines over the last just 4 years. The number of countries who have publicly called for China to comply with the arbitral award has almost quadrupled over the span of the Marcos administration, because the transparency effort launched by the Philippines has really brought in not just the Europeans, but the Indians, the Koreans. And so I think that will continue to pay dividends. And it'll not just result in diplomatic support, but it helps facilitate a lot of the operational coordination we're seeing between Japan, Philippines, Australia, Philippines, France, Philippines, etc.
We should talk about the arbitral tribunal, since it is the 10-year anniversary.
If we must.
So this is a binding ruling that the Permanent Court of Arbitration delivered in response to a case the Philippines brought against China, saying that most of China's claims in the South China Sea are effectively unlawful. So would be interesting to go a little deeper on the tribunal, why China hates it so much and the degree to which it really matters or is connected to what's actually happening on the water today.
So I will not go through all 14 points that the Philippines
I'm
won.
grateful for that, actually.
But I do think it's the most noteworthy.
I should have specified, but without doing the 14.
The most noteworthy thing is that the Philippines brought 15 claims against China, and it won 14 and a quarter of them. There was 3/4 of one claim that the court didn't find jurisdiction. So this is not some contested narrow victory. This was an overwhelming victory. The key parts are, and I think the most important for the outside party, is one, the court ruled that the whole conceit of historic rights is nonsense. It doesn't have any grounding in international law, and if it ever did, it was extinguished the day that China ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So all of this stuff that the U.S. cares about on freedom of the seas was baked in by the award. Second, that there are no islands in the Spratly Islands, at least no fully entitled ones, meaning that these little teeny tiny rocks and reefs, they do not get 200-mile exclusive economic zones. They do not get continental shelves. They get little bubbles of territorial seas at best. And what that means is that all the waters around those bubbles belong to whoever the coastal state is, Philippines or Vietnam or Malaysia. And that's really kind of taken off the table what had been a longstanding argument that, everything is up for negotiation, because in theory, everything in the South China Sea is disputed. No, it's not. The overwhelming majority is undisputed Philippine waters or Philippine seabed or Vietnamese seabed, etc. And then I guess the last that matters most to Scarborough Shoal is the court said it can't rule on who gets to own which rock. But in the case of Scarborough, everybody has the right to fish because everybody historically has fished. And so on all of those points, obviously, China remains non-compliant with the award. That has led people to say, well, the award doesn't matter. And in fact, the previous Philippine government of Rodrigo Duterte famously said the award doesn't matter. It's just a piece of waste paper. It has not changed China's behavior yet. It has changed the way that China tries to justify its claims. In international polite society, you can no longer talk about the 9-dash line, and China doesn't. Chinese lawyers, when they're in China, they talk about the 9-dash line. Outside of China, they've come up with a kind of series of increasingly complex and so far unsuccessful efforts to justify the claim that without moving beyond the language that kind of everybody outside of the PRC now knows is bunk because of the award. International awards are overwhelmingly complied with even by great powers for a reason, and that's that they do kind of have a malignant effect on your standing in the international community. They do eat away at the legitimacy that you need to get acquiescence on whatever your preferred norms and rules and standards are. So I do think that this hurts China and will continue to hurt China as long as the Philippines and its friends and partners continue to talk about it. The number of countries that support it will continue to grow. I think we'll see as the Philippines becomes increasingly cynical about hopes of any negotiated settlement with China, particularly this year as the Code of Conduct talks fail yet again during the Philippines ASEAN chair. You'll see the Philippines bring this up more and more in, say, the UN, I think pursue additional arbitrations. And we've seen this work time and time again. It worked against the U.S. when Nicaragua did it. It took 10 years, but the U.S. did finally comply with an ICJ ruling that it walked away from under Reagan. I think we're seeing it work in real time against the UK in the case of the Mauritius case over Chagos, where Mauritius has won 3 different arbitrations and multiple UN votes. We saw it work against Russia when it lost the Arctic Sunrise case now 12 years ago to the Netherlands. In all of these cases, the bigger power complies without ever admitting that's what it's doing, because great powers never admit that they lost, but they do try to make the reputational damage go away.
So you might argue the arbitral tribunal matters just in different ways potentially over time. So maybe right now it's more about giving the rest of the world an easier case for supporting the Philippines when they're under pressure from China in the South China Sea, which, I mean, is not a given, right? It's not convenient to oppose China on anything, let alone on behalf of, if you're talking about Europe, a country very far away. And the clear basis of the Philippines' position in international law makes that coalition stronger. But maybe over time, you potentially do see more or some effect in China's own calculation.
Yeah. And look, this process could have gone a lot faster if the Philippines had not changed presidents 12 days before the award came out. If we had a government in Manila who had pushed this award when it was at its maximal kind of exposure in the international mindset in 2016, you could right now have 50 countries who have publicly endorsed the award. Instead, the Marcos administration had to belatedly go back and remind people about this thing and do the laborious one by one adding ticks to the box.
And the U.S. only endorsed the tribunal ruling in 2020 anyway. So even that was...
Well, the U.S., the day it was released, endorsed the award in the sense that it's binding on China and the Philippines. The U.S. only acknowledged in 2020 that it agreed with all the merits for complicated reasons, same reason that the French were slow to do it, because we also have teeny tiny rocks out in the Pacific that we want to claim full exclusive economic zones from. So there was resistance on the legal side to some of the precedents being set here. But that's been swiped away now. Yeah, the 2020 position paper on the South China Sea that was issued by the first Trump administration solidified that the U.S. acknowledges that the court was right in all matters.
So it seems like the South China Sea is subject to at least 2 different sets of rules. Even if both are observed rather imperfectly, you have UNCLOS, the international law piece, which is about universality, et cetera. The arbitral tribunal would fall into this category. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, you have the 2002 Declaration on Conduct, which is a negotiated non-binding agreement between China and ASEAN that's really about maintaining the status quo, more or less. So first of all, would you agree with that? And how do these frameworks shape China's behavior? And what do they mean for the overall picture in the South China Sea? And how do you see adherence over time to really any set of rules in such a complicated environment?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's also a third kind of quote set of rules that shapes China's behavior at least as much, if not more, which is the U.S. alliance, in particular the U.S. alliance with the Philippines, which I think matters far more to China's day-to-day decision-making than whether or not occupation is permitted under the 2002 DOC. So on the one hand, the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties, I'm not sure it's really shaping China's behavior much at all anymore. The DOC has never been operationalized. So the DOC was negotiated. The first draft was written by the Philippines at the behest of other ASEAN member states in 1998. And then they took it, the ASEAN member states accepted it internally, they took it to China, and they hit a wall. China has never given an inch on any of the things that they wanted to negotiate on. So the DOC has all of these very nice things, shoulds and woulds and will tries on fisheries management, search and rescue, scientific research. Not a single one of them has ever been operationalized because Beijing will not give even the minimal concessions that it would take to make any of that work. The only thing the DOC says really is we will not occupy currently unoccupied features. Well, China has been de facto occupying Scarborough Shoal for the last 14 years. It deployed numerous semi-permanent, uncrewed buoys and other structures at the shoal over the last year.
What occupation
Right. Occupation
is
increasingly
contested.
seems like a fig leaf, and I'm not sure how much longer that will last. I think it's quite clear that China does intend to occupy Scarborough in some formal, permanent way whenever it's convenient for Beijing, and the DOC is not going to stop it. The code of conduct that was supposed to grow out of the DOC has really become this albatross for ASEAN states, and particularly for the Philippines. For years now, anytime any of the claimant states tries to do something outside of the ASEAN framework, outside of the code of conduct talks, they get lambasted both by China and by some of the less sympathetic members of their own grouping for violating ASEAN centrality. But then the code never goes anywhere. The code's not working, right? The code is now old enough to rent a car, and it hasn't made any progress. The code is the same age as Google as a company. And so Southeast Asian states are just not allowed to advance their own interests in any way because this code is deemed sacrosanct in some way. That at the end of the day, that's what the Philippines has realized and why it went to an arbitral tribunal in 2013 and why it continues to advance its interests primarily outside of ASEAN by tightening ties with the international community and by seeking through the UNCLOS framework, not this diplomatic framework. Vietnam does the same. Vietnam just does it standing behind the Philippines, rooting the Philippines on, while Manila takes all of the lumps from Beijing, and Vietnam, and to a degree others, including Indonesia, get to win all the benefits of the precedents that the Philippines has gotten in court.
How does the South China Sea fit into China's broader plans for its maritime periphery, including if we're looking at the waters of the East China Sea, which separates China from Japan, as well as the Taiwan Strait? How does all of this fit together?
So I think increasingly we're seeing the concept that all of this is a single littoral. The Japanese primarily developed the concept of the single operating theater across the East China Sea and the South China Sea. We're seeing that gain traction in the Philippines, in the U.S., even I think quietly among other ASEAN states, because while the nature of the claims are slightly different in all these places, what they have in common is that they are excessive. They take little notice of international law. They seem to embrace a degree of exceptionalism that Beijing is now being quite explicit about, that at least in Asia, in China's, quote, near waters, international law need not apply. And that has dangerous implications for all of the small and middle powers of the Indo-Pacific. So while the nature of the South China Sea claims are uniquely illegal and uniquely maximalist, what they represent is the same that the East China Sea claims represent to Japan or the LC claims to Korea, which is, a China that believes it has now outgrown the constraints of international rules and norms and laws, unless those rules, laws, and norms were written exclusively by China for China's benefit. Operationally, we also see the lessons learned in the South China Sea now spilling out into gray zone coercion in the Taiwan Strait and in the East China Sea and the LOC more and more frequently. And so while there is a far larger number of militia and Coast Guard operating in the South China Sea, we are seeing those tactics applied across the whole littoral. So I think all of this helps explain why we hear Philippine and Japanese officials calling each other quasi-allies these days, because they are. They face the same threat, at least in their minds, just in different clothes.
Looking ahead, do you expect the effects of climate change will have an impact on these conflicts in the South China Sea. And do you think the set of risks associated with climate change are something that China is anticipating and planning for in its own South China Sea posture?
Not in changing the physical outposts or islands. I get the question a lot whether or not climate change will just take care of these things for us.
How much ocean rise do we need for the South China Sea to be solved?
So, I will defer to the marine scientists here. The healthy coral reefs, rising seas itself doesn't do much about them because each species of coral likes a certain amount of sunlight for photosynthesis and so tends to rise.
The features grow with the water level.
Yeah, so the coral keeps up in the same way a plant turns toward the sunlight in your window. Now, ocean acidification is a different question. So as the ocean becomes more acidic and kills off some of these coral, maybe that eliminates that. But the Chinese islands, of course, are all dead. There's no living coral under them. But I'm going to be going on a family vacation to the Outer Banks in a couple of weeks. I don't know how many tons of sand the state of North Carolina trucked in this spring to keep the Outer Banks from being washed out. But China will continue to do the same. So this is an engineering challenge. But as long as China's willing to keep up with it, it's not one that climate change is going to eliminate. Climate change will eliminate some of the triggers for conflict, but not in ways we want. So as climate change worsens what's already potentially like extinction level events for the fisheries in the South China Sea, more and more small and artisanal operators in the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia will have to start driving taxis and finding other means of livelihood because they already have to go out for weeks to catch what they used to consider bait fish. It's increasingly not a viable livelihood. Mostly that's because of overfishing and massive ecological destruction, including the island building campaigns. But it'll be made worse by climate change. So that's a perverse fact. But yeah, there will be less fisheries conflict in the South China Sea because there's less fish.
But before you get to less conflict, you would get to more conflict,
yeah, that's right.
Like along the path of scarcity.
And significant strain on coastal economies where you can't, how do you support tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, not just the fishers themselves, but those involved in fish processing, in local markets, in the larger fisheries industry who will need to move into some other means of life. So this is not like, I don't think we should be cheering this, but yeah, there will be less fisheries conflict because the fisheries in the South China Sea are collapsing at a rate that should scare us. And I should note this matters to all of us. The South China Sea is the most productive fishery on the planet. It accounts for at least 12% of global fish catch, and it's going away pretty quickly.
On that ominous note, we'll have to wrap there. Greg, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Happy to be a bummer.
It's always good to be at least informed in your fear regarding the geopolitical future of Asia, so I appreciate that. To learn more about the South China Sea, you can pick up a copy of Greg's fantastic book called On Dangerous Ground. And as always, we would love to hear what you thought of today's conversation and what issues you would like the show to unpack in future episodes. You can send your ideas to Pekingology at CSIS.org. And if you haven't already, please rate, review, and subscribe to the show. We will be back in your feed very soon.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.